Hello students, welcome to today's class. Now as we saw the history of abnormal behavior through the Renaissance and the 16th centuries, that is the latter part of the Middle Ages, we have seen some important events such as the witch hunts and the rise of certain influential thinkers who put forward a humane understanding of mental disorder. For instance, we have Weir and Vincent de Paul and Reginald Scott and Saint Teresa of Avila. Now we come to another feature which was in fact the last part of the Middle Ages, the establishment of the early asylums and shrines, or the establishment of the earliest mental hospitals. Now 16th century onwards, there was a lot of growth in the establishment of asylums and shrines, and a number of shrines for taking care of the mentally ill came into being. Now one thing I want you to be very clear about is that these asylums, shrines or hospitals were not what their names suggest. They were not hospitals, they were not pleasant spaces where the mentally ill were cared for. In fact, to be very precise, they were filthy, cruel storage houses. Storage houses meant to remove the insane from the society in some way and store them in some place where no one would bother what would happen to them. Now, the first hospital in Europe is considered to be the Valencia Hospital, established by Father Juan Pilberto Joffer in Spain. Now, this is a very contested fact and many people don't consider this the first hospital. The jury is still out on this, but still people believe that this was precisely the first mental hospital in Europe. In 1547, the monastery of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London was converted into a mental hospital. Now this is a mental hospital which occupies an important place in the history of abnormal psychology because it exemplifies the inhuman treatment meted out to the mentally ill. Now this monastery was converted into the Bethlehem Hospital, and within a short period of time its name got contracted to Bethlehem Hospital. Its name got contracted to Bethlehem, and it in fact gave rise to a new word in the English language, bedlam, or what we see as uproar, what we take to be as uproar, because the conditions in Bethlehem Hospital were just chaos, a lot of filth, cruelty and uproar. That is why even a new word in English language came out of the name of the hospital. Now there were soon other hospitals in other places in Europe. For instance, the first hospital in the Americas was the San Hipólito, which was put forward by philanthropist Bernardino Alvarez in Mexico. Similarly, the first hospital in France was La Maison de Charenton in Paris. In the United States, the Pennsylvania Hospital, the establishment of which was done under the direction of Benjamin Franklin, had a few wards for mental patients. But an exclusive mental hospital, exclusively for mentally ill patients perhaps, was the hospital at Williamsburg, Virginia. That was the first one in the United States. Then there were other asylums in Moscow, in Russia. And in 1764, the notorious Lunatics Tower was started in Vienna. Now this is another hospital or another asylum which needs a special mention, just like the Bethlehem Hospital. Now what was this Lunatics Tower in Vienna? This was in fact a showplace tower in the middle of the city, a circular tower with square rooms. It was a showplace, and when it was converted into a hospital, the caregivers and the doctors lived in these square rooms, and you will be surprised and disgusted to know that the patients were actually kept in the spaces between the walls of these rooms. They were tied in the spaces in these walls, and those left over were actually tied to the outside of the tower. And if this was not enough, they would be put on exhibit as if some kind of comic show was going on. They would be put on exhibit for a small fee. You can see the degeneration of mankind and the kind of treatment the mentally ill received. And even in the other hospitals, even though they may not have been as inhuman as the Lunatics Tower, most of the treatments were meant towards intimidating and scaring the patients rather than caring for them. For instance, There would be mechanical restraints, there would be electrical shocks, they would be thrown into boiling water or freezing water and given irrational amounts of drugs and such other treatments such as blistering and even cupping, where hot burning cups were placed on the skin. Now, these were the kind of treatments that mentally ill patients received. Clearly, by the 18th century, it was a commonly understood fact that the mental hospitals all over Europe were in dire need of reform. And this reform was pioneered by two influential people. The first was Vincenzo Chiarugi, the superintendent of Ospedale di Bonifacio, a hospital in Florence, Italy. And the second was Jean Baptiste Poussin, who directed the incurables ward at La Bicêtre, a large hospital in Paris. Now, Poussin forbade his staff to beat the patients, and in fact he ordered that many of the patients who had been chained or shackled for years be released. Now, this kind of an instruction almost created a revolt among all the attendants and caregivers, because they felt that it was nothing less than dangerous and life-threatening to release these kind of deranged people. But Poussin stood by his orders, and in fact, when these people were released, they were allowed to move about, have some fresh air, feel some sense of personal liberty. Surprisingly, they became more manageable and their mental health improved. Now, Poussin's reforms were extended by Philippe Pinel, who took over as a superintendent of La Bicêtre from Poussin. Pinel believed that the mentally ill, in fact, were normal human beings who were deprived of their reason by certain severe personal problems and personal tragedies, and hence to treat them like animals or even worse than that was nothing short of inhuman. Now, in these mental hospitals, including La Bicêtre, the patients were kept not only shackled but in dungeons where there was no kind of sunlight, and no one even bothered to look whether they were chained in a standing position or a sitting position. And in fact, many of the patients were chained for months. They used to keep standing. So this was the kind of situation that prevailed. Now, what Pinel did was to replace these dungeons, apart from the unshackling which had already taken place under Poussin. He also said that the dungeons should be removed, and he replaced them with sunny, airy rooms. And he also did away and removed violent treatments such as bleeding, cupping and blistering. Apart from that, Pinel also spent long hours talking to the patients, the kind of counseling and therapy we use today, listening to their problems, understanding their needs, and most importantly, he kept detailed records of these conversations and interviews of his patients, as also of the progress of disease, as to when the disease appeared, what were the symptoms, what were the treatments, and the pattern the disease followed. So this kind of recording provided a data on the basis of which future research and experimentation could be based, and hence this was a very path-breaking approach. After Pinel's retirement, Jean Esquirol started almost 10 new hospitals in various parts of France to continue the work of Poussin and Pinel, and these hospitals reflected the same humane therapy that had been initiated at La Bicêtre. Now, at around the same time when this kind of innovative medical practices and the reformation of the asylums was taking place in Italy and France, similar developments were also taking place in northern England, and here the developments were led by a Quaker named William Tuke. Now, William Tuke believed that the best possible treatment for mentally ill patients would be to provide them a quiet, calm and religious atmosphere. And in a kind of experiment, he took a group of mental patients to a distant farmhouse in the countryside, which was the York Retreat. And in this pleasant country house or farmhouse, the mentally ill patients prayed, worked, rested, talked about their problems, took short walks in the countryside and lived a peaceful life. And in fact, innovatively, even animals were introduced in the York Retreat so as to make the surroundings more pleasant. Now, the York Retreat by William Tuke in this way actually represented the culmination of the battle against the inhumanity persisting in the asylums of those days. The Quakers in fact believed in a kind acceptance of all people, including the mentally ill. And slowly the notion grew that an acceptance of people who suffered from mental disorders could actually lead to an improvement in their condition. And if we see even today, the acceptance of patients as they are, which is the first step towards recovery. And this was identified way back in Northern England by William Tuke. Now, as the news of Pinel's, Puzin's and Tuke's experiments and the success of these experiments grew, there were more and more followers who actually wanted to walk on the same lines. Some of them were John Connolly and Samuel Hitch. For instance, Hitch introduced trained nurses and nursing supervisors in the wards at Gloucester Asylum. And slowly, step by step, one by one, innovative practices, a more humane treatment and the reformation of mental asylums began. Now these efforts, the cumulative efforts of Pinel, Puzin, Tuke and their followers like Connolly and Hitch can be listed under a common term of moral therapy. Now moral therapy was based on the idea that mentally ill people were nothing but ordinary people who had certain extraordinary problems in life, and because of these extraordinary problems they behaved in pathological ways. And so moral therapy believed that the best form of treatment for such kind of mentally ill would be to provide them a peaceful, tranquil atmosphere where they could live in peace and they could do some useful work. Of course, moral therapy, like all other innovative and positive practices of the time, faced a lot of criticism. But the success of the therapy was more than the criticisms that it received. For instance, records show that during the first half of the 19th century in hospitals all over Europe, where moral therapy was the only kind of therapy practiced, there was almost 70% recovery in patients suffering from mental disorders. Now we have seen the reform in the asylums starting from Italy, then in France, then in England. Now in United States, this revolution was initiated by Benjamin Rush, who is also called the father of American psychiatry. He was the first to write a treatise on mental disorders in America. He was the first who organized a medical course in psychiatry, and as a physician, the foremost physician of Pennsylvania Hospital, he devoted his attention almost exclusively to mental disorders. Now, Rush's medical theory was, of course, tainted with astrology. There was a lot of primitive thinking. For instance, he advocated treatments such as bloodletting and purgatives, which of course, as we know, were primitive treatments. Similarly, he introduced a primitive treatment called the tranquilizing chair. Now, this tranquilizing chair was meant to let the patients relax their muscles, because Rush believed that the relaxation of the muscles would reduce the pressure of blood on the brain. But this tranquilizing chair was anything but tranquilizing for the patients, and in fact, people who experienced it described it as nothing less than traumatic. Now, even though Rush's medical theory consisted of such primitive practices, still there were a lot of humane treatments also that he advocated. For instance, he told doctors, nurses and other attendants to take small presents such as cakes or fruits for the patients regularly, so that the patients would feel happy. Similarly, he also said that attendants who are hired to look after the patients should be kind and intelligent, so that they can share in the activities of the patients, they can talk with them, they can read out to them, discuss ideas, and thus keep the patient in good spirits. Now, Benjamin Rush, even with his primitive thinking, is essentially a major force in American psychiatry. In fact, we can see him as a transitional figure who marks American psychiatry's movement from the older primitive ages into a new modern age of humane understanding of mental disorders. Now, a prominent figure in the 19th and 20th centuries was Dorothea Dix, a Boston school teacher. Now, even though moral therapy had progressed, still it was on a very small scale, and many of the asylums were still in a very deplorable condition. It was around this time that Dorothea Dix, a Boston school teacher who herself was a child of very unfortunate and impoverished conditions. It was during this time that she rose into prominence. At the age of 40, she began as a Sunday school teacher in prison. And in the prison, she saw the deplorable condition in which the mentally ill were living as prisoners. Later, she visited a number of squalid jails and poorhouses across America to study the condition of the mentally ill who had been kept there, in fact, had been stored there. And later, she went abroad to visit the York Retreat and other moral therapy institutions across Europe. And based on her observations, she began asking for a more humane treatment for the mentally ill patients. In fact, she lectured state legislatures that it was their responsibility to provide for more humane conditions for the mentally ill patients. She called for the mentally ill to be put in hospitals meant for their special care, meant for their special treatment, and that they should not be isolated in some kind of poorhouses and jails where they would be left to fend for themselves. Now, Dix's struggle continued for nearly 40 years, and she had a wide-reaching influence on the state legislatures, and almost 20 states in the United States started their efforts to put Dix's vision into practice. Later, from the United States, Dix carried on her campaign to Scotland and Canada and other parts of Europe, and she was responsible for the founding and funding of 32 mental hospitals, and in fact for the rise of a movement where mental patients were treated as more dignified individuals and were given better physical care. In fact, a resolution passed by the US Congress in 1901 characterizes her as the noblest examples of humanity in all history. So we can see the kind of pioneering effort that Dorothea Dix put and how she single-handedly undertook a campaign to improve the conditions of the mentally ill in America. Although Dorothea Dix's efforts were no doubt pioneering and invaluable, it led to certain unfortunate consequences which Dix perhaps may not have imagined herself. One of them was the decline of moral therapy. Now, Dix had advocated the rise of hospitals, a number of mental hospitals, so as to house a large number of mentally ill who had been earlier neglected in jails and poorhouses. Accordingly, a number of hospitals sprang up. But the thing was that the mindset of the American polity was still that they did not consider mental illness on par with physical illness. So even though they constructed a number of hospitals, the funding was not on par with that for physical illnesses. So lesser fundings meant more hospitals but yet less staff. So slowly the hospitals started increasing, the number of patients started increasing, but the staff was less and there was overcrowding, turmoil and chaos. Now, in such an atmosphere where no kind of tranquil or peaceful conditions were available, the practice of moral therapy became almost impossible. Secondly, the hospitals sprang up so quickly that there were not enough moral therapy practitioners to actually take care of patients in all these hospitals. Now, the mental hygiene movement which Dorothea Dix advocated also focused on physical well-being, because her thoughts were focused at a time when she had seen prisoners and mentally ill being treated in a very deplorable way. There was no care of their physical needs. So of course, naturally, she advocated a kind of approach which assisted them in fulfilling their basic physical needs. Now slowly this led to a concentration only on the physical needs of the patients, which were more or less fulfilled in these hospitals, whereas the doctors and the attendants were not really bothered about levels of mental hygiene or whether the patients can be treated and brought back to a normal state. So their physical needs were taken care of, but apart from that, they were helpless and dependent on a mental front. Now, there were also other reasons for the decline of moral therapy. Moral therapy was something which had been pioneered by really influential people such as Philippe Pinel and Tuke. Of course, they had followers, but none of their followers were as influential as the pioneering researchers. and hence the absence of a powerful second generation of moral therapy advocates led to a slow decline of this practice. Now, another reason for the decline of moral therapy was that many of these newly developed hospitals were funded and run by Protestant establishments, whereas a majority of the mentally ill were Irish Catholic immigrants. Now, here came the Protestant Catholic divide, and the Protestant management were at the most ready to house these mentally ill from Irish Catholic background, but they were not ready to actually put out funds for giving them the luxury of moral therapy or giving them the luxury of any kind of mental treatments meant for their recovery. The maximum they would do was to provide them physical refuge. A third reason for the decline of moral therapy was the rise of the medical model. It was at that time that drug therapies, the biological causation views were slowly rising. But of course, they had not achieved a great degree of advancement. They were still in the primitive level. But still, the concentration of doctors, of researchers moved to the medical model. So everyone was concerned about biological causations, about improving the biological state of health and including drugs in treatment. Whereas the importance of enhancing psychological health, which had been introduced by the moral therapists, slowly declined. Thus, slowly towards the latter part of the 19th century, the mental health professionals began to have a greater role in the treatment of mental disorders, and laymen or moral therapists and their role began to decline. And these mental health professionals were not the kind of professionals we would think them of as, and in layman's terms they were often called the alienists because they alienated or isolated the mentally ill patient from normal life. And as they acquired more status, they began to put forward their half-baked or preliminary knowledge about medical advances and of the medical model, which was far from complete. Moreover, they advocated a sense of Victorian morality, which they felt was important for mental sanity. For instance, they believed that a highly moral life was essential for good health. Moreover, their understanding of medical disorders and the entire phenomenon of mental health was totally lacking. For instance, they had a vague understanding of certain factors. They felt emotional problems, thought problems, and mental deterioration was caused by a lifestyle of excesses or a using up of precious nerve force or nerve energy, and so on. Thus, towards the end of the 19th century, slowly with the decline of moral therapy and the increase in hospitalization and the number of asylums, the tolerance of mentally ill patients in the community lessened. People were not willing to tolerate even the most mildly or slightly mentally ill patient among them. And patients who showed any kind of strange behavior or even the slightest forms of mental disorders were immediately isolated and sent to mental hospitals. Now, this kind of a mental hospital environment further enhanced chances of disease. It further increased the mental disorders which the patient was already suffering from. It reduced reality orientation, and further the stigma, prejudice and sick role associated with the hospital life often made the patients permanent patients, in the sense that even those who had entered the mental hospital with slight disorders continued to stay there year after year, because all means of reintegrating back into the normal life were closed for them. Their helplessness and dependency increased, and they became permanent inmates of the mental hospital. And by the end of the 19th century, the mental hospital in America was something of a symbol, of a social symbol which could be seen by all people in the society, a kind of fortress-like appearance, a separate landmark in the city, which most public viewed as a strange, eerie place. For the public, it was something different from their normal lives. It was something away from reality, from their notions of normalcy. And for the mental patients who were isolated there, it was a relatively harsh place with harsh treatment. This period, even though it began with the relatively well-meaning efforts by Dix and others, towards the end of the period we can see a division among the normal population and among the mentally ill, the fortress in the city which the normal people cannot access and do not wish to. And the doctors of those times did little to actually change these notions, to change the kind of gap that was forming between the mentally ill and the rest of the society.